Hello, and welcome to our November 2021 Gender Talk with esteemed scholar of Indigenous Gender and Sexuality Studies, Dr. Joseph Pierce. My name is Dr. M. Shadi Malaklu, and I'm the inaugural director of the Bell Hooks Center at Berea College and chair of its Women's and Gender and soon-to-be Sexuality Studies Department. Dr. Pierce, a citizen of Cherokee Nation, is author of the 2019 manuscript, Argentine Intimacies, Queer Kinship in an Age of Splendor, 1890 through 1910, published with SUNY Press. His research focuses on the intersections of kinship, gender, sexuality, and race in Latin America, 19th century literature and culture, queer studies, indigenous studies, and hemispheric approaches to citizenship and belonging. We have invited Dr. Pierce to speak with us today, not least of all because November marks the oft unrecognized Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month. To those ends, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that we at Berea are situated in unceded Shawnee territory, just a stone's throw away from where Daniel Boone's colonial expedition settled west of the Appalachian Mountains. We have much work to do to decolonize our college and our community in ways that do not reproduce decolonization as an apolitical metaphor. I hope that today's conversation can help us begin to think through these political stakes and to contextualize our own conditions of possibility within the gendered settler colonial matrix that Bell Hooks describes as imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. We are additionally excited to be in conversation with Dr. Pierce because our department's new curriculum to be implemented next fall, will ask students to use the insights of Indigenous feminist thinkers to interrogate heteronormative assumptions about embodiment and the mind that reproduce colonial categories of sex and gender difference. I was overjoyed when Dr. Pierce accepted our invitation, and we are eager to think with him today about the other than human relations that sustain Indigenous life worlds and which point towards other ways of being and doing and knowing and feeling that the rest of us might inhabit in order to save the earth that sustains us. While Indigenous studies and those of us who take it up are often preoccupied with the relationship between land, bodies, and people, many Indigenous stories describe communal relationships with the stars. In today's remarks, Dr. Pierce will explore how queer kinship can be expressed as a relationship with land and other than human beings, but also with the stars. These celestial relations, he explains, are part of Indigenous traditions of emergence and endurance, and as such can teach us how to imagine future worlds. Responding to Dr. Pierce's remarks today is one of the Bell Hooks Center's inaugural teacher scholars in residence, and instructor of our Decolonizing Feminism class, Dr. Fari Nzinga. Dr. Nzinga centers object-oriented learning in her classroom, in the gallery spaces she curates, and in non-traditional art spaces that engage the contemporary cultural and political problems of the day. Her research on Black feminist cultural production, visual material and expressive culture, and sexual politics draws heavily from Bell Hooks's analysis of power and forms of domination, and on her emphasis on love, care, and the making of home places. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the hard work of my colleagues, namely our program associates, students Rocky Garbanzo Nunez, Amber Miller, Autumn Young, and Malaya Wright, and my administrative colleague, Kat Moses, without whom none of what we do would be possible. Additionally, I want to thank our audiovisual engineer, Kyle Wooten, for his support and expertise. For those of you who are part of the Berea College community, we hope that you will also consider joining us on campus this evening at the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education for a truth talk about Indigenous erasure. That event will begin at 6 p.m. and is co-sponsored by the Espacio Cultural Latinx Center on campus. Food will be provided. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Dr. Joseph Pierce, and respondent, Dr. Fari Nzinga. You are welcome to ask questions throughout using the Q&A function on your Zoom dashboard. We will address your questions at the end. Thank you, Dr. Pierce.
Hi, thank you so much for this kind invitation and introduction. I have felt very cared for throughout, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you. I'm going to introduce myself first in Cherokee, and then we'll talk about some stars. Osio nigad galielik nigad chichedo kohik tla os jiwoni chalaki anest aseno ganeltisco. Joseph Dawado, Chalagi Gudino Josawi Dawado, Corpus Christi Dige Gaseno Nowu Brooklyn Ginel, Stony Brook Galuladilla Jundel Squad Dagiluzda Nejo. My name is Joseph Pierce. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation, and I'm speaking with you from Brooklyn, also known as Lenapehoking, the land of Lenape people. So before I talk about queerness, land, and sky, I want to give a brief account of something that's been on my mind recently as we are in Native American Heritage Month. It is important to think about our practices of repair, what we are talking about when we discuss decolonial praxis or reparative praxis. One of those practices is a land acknowledgement. In recent years, institutions have incorporated some form of recognition of the land and the Indigenous people whose land was stolen in order for that institution to exist where it does today. We often hear about Indigenous people in the past tense during a land acknowledgement. This land was theirs, as if they are no longer here, as if the land no longer remembers them. Or sometimes we hear the word stewardship. They were the original stewards of this land. The word stewardship elicits reverent nods from the audience, nods in agreement that the land needs to be recognized and the people were indeed its stewards. But a nod is not enough. Acknowledgement is not enough. The problem with the land acknowledgement is that it is often not followed by meaningful action, meaningful engagement with the land and with the peoples whose land was stolen. Acknowledgement without action is an empty gesture, exculpatory and self-serving. It is performative. And in a sense, a land acknowledgement is doubly performative. It feigns care while simultaneously instantiating the recognition of the impossibility of an Indigenous presence. I recognize the land performs the action that it names, but this action is incommensurable with Indigenous forms of reciprocity and mutuality. For one can only reciprocate by accepting the responsibilities that the land has entrusted us to carry out. Are we carrying out those instructions? Are we acting as good relatives? I'm not saying that we shouldn't recognize the land, rather that doing so must be a beginning, not an end of our engagement. If the land is our relative, then we cannot simply acknowledge it as land. We must understand what our responsibilities are to the land that is our kin. We must, in other words, engage in a reciprocal relationship with the land. Land, in this case, is not just earth, water, sky, mountains, trees, but the territories, the animate and more than human kin that populate this world. It is in its animate multiplicities an ongoing enactment of reciprocity. Acknowledgement and reciprocity are not the same thing. Acknowledgement implies a singular point of view, typically a human one, and the ability to bestow recognition onto the surface of the land. The land, in that scenario, receives our acknowledgement but does not respond. This is insufficient, and we have to do better. Land does not require that you confirm it exists, rather that you reciprocate the care that it has given you. The land exists regardless of the acknowledgement, which is only ever a first step. Next steps involve treating territory as kin, building relationships with that land itself as if it were your kin, because it is. If we acknowledge the land on the terms laid out by liberal or multicultural inclusion, we are only repeating the hubris of anthropocentrism. To acknowledge the land on the land's terms is an act of reciprocity. And it is reciprocity rather than recognition that the land requires, because that is what it has already given. The land did not recognize you when you were born. It already knew you were coming and provided for you, cared for you. It has already given you what you are. At this point, you may be thinking, but what am I supposed to do? How can I engage with the land in a reciprocal rather than an extractive way? It's a good question, and one that requires that we listen to the Indigenous people who can help us understand how the land should be treated. It requires humility and resources and time. And I can't speak for other communities, but I would like to share a few stories today from the Cherokee tradition, which I think teach us some of these things. The first story I want to tell is about the Pleiades constellation and the pine tree. In case you want to follow up on these stories, I'm going to cite from the published version that appears in James Mooney's Myths of the Cherokee, though of course there are other versions of these stories. So here's the story according to Mooney's ethnographic record. Quote, "Long ago, when the world was new, there were 7 boys who liked to play rather than do their chores. Their mothers would scold." Oh, wait, sorry. This is not a direct quote. This is me drawing on Mooney. Sorry. Okay. "Long ago, when the world was new, there were 7 boys who liked to play rather than do their chores. Their mothers would scold them, tell them that they needed to help out, do their chores, but it was no use. One day, their mothers decided to punish the boys by putting rocks in their corn dinner. So when the boys came home to eat, they chomped down on stones and were furious. They left the house in protest and began to dance. Around and around they dance until they begin to rise. Higher and higher they go into the heavens. Their mother goes looking for them, but it is too late. The boys are already out of reach, except for one. His mother manages to pull him down, and he strikes the ground with such force that he is swallowed up by the earth. The remaining 6 boys enter the heavens and become the Pleiades. The mother, in her grief, cries at the loss of her sons, and from her tears, in the spot where the son who had been swallowed up by the earth, a pine tree grows and reaches up toward the heavens. The pine is of the same nature as the stars and holds in itself the same bright light. The boys just want to dance. Their bodies rise from the earth, their bodies together rising, spiraling upward like smoke from the sacred fire. In the movement of their bodies together, they become celestial. The constellation is formed of these boys, the children who would not stop dancing, who themselves became stars. Here, the son brought down to earth wants to return to his brothers, and so becomes pine tree, reaching toward the heavens. The sky is full of our relatives. The plants, too, our kin, want to reach out and touch the heavens. which is another way of saying to become whole again. The pine tree is celestial in this way, reaching up to reform kinship, to reattach to his brothers. There's no English word for what these boys become. Ani Jogon, a constellation. Of course, the Pleiades is significant to many Indigenous communities. For the Haudenosaunee, it is the hole through which Sky Woman fell when she descended to Earth. The story of Sky Woman falling from the heavens is crucial to how the Haudenosaunee people are descended from the stars. When Sky Woman falls, the swans soften her descent. The turtle offers his back for her to land. Muskrat sacrifices himself, bringing up earth from the depths of the ocean that will grow around her and become Turtle Island. These stories teach us about collaboration and care, about reciprocity, and about the space between realms, eras, people. They teach us of time travel, of crossing the breach. Through our stories, we understand that we are connected to all things that have been and all things that will be. We recognize and are recognized by others as part of an emergent relationality through which the bonds of accountability and reciprocity are not restricted to the imposed epistemic arrangements of the colonial order. Cherokee scholar Daniel Heath Justice describes the quality of being a good relative as working to counter the exploitative forces of colonialism and the stories that legitimize them, while at the same time affirming or reaffirming better, more generative, more generous ways to uphold our obligations and our commitments to our diverse and varied kin. In addition to justice, scholars and activists aligned with Indigenous feminisms see their task as aiming to, quote, to free Native people from extending the power relations required by colonial regimes, which include heteropatriarchy, and to frame gender and sexuality as central to workforce sovereignty and decolonization, end quote. These proposals situate the urgent demands for decolonial praxis as returning to and sustaining our being in good relations, which necessarily requires the rejection of heterosexism, patriarchal dominance, capitalism, anthropocentrism. In the Cherokee tradition, to be in good relations means honoring the ancestors and the future generations by making ethical decisions in the present regarding human and more than human kin. Like many Indigenous communities, we draw on the wisdom of the past 7 generations and think about the next 7 generations when making decisions. By cultivating and harnessing the shared wisdom of kin, we create sustainable, mutually reinforcing relations. As I would like to propose here, we create kinstallations. The term kinstallation joins constellation and kin. But this neologism is not an attempt to describe a new or previously misunderstood phenomenon. Instead, it is an effort to foreground ancestral knowledge in the present. In this, I am thinking along with Cree scholar Karen Recollet, who coined the term kinstallations. And I am arguing that resurgence, reconnection, and survivance can be enacted through kinstallatory imaginings, celestial resistance that is nevertheless grounded in Indigenous epistemologies and centered on the land as a site of perpetual memory making. Kinstallations enact our ancestral knowledge of the stars, of our own stories of creation and of survival in an ongoing reflexive relationality that is non-hierarchical and ephemeral. It is an ongoing act of a praxis of Indigenous refusal to acquiesce to colonial normativities, the ontological and the epistemological, in favor of land-based understandings of reciprocity. Land holds memory, even when humans forget. Land holds bodies and medicine and spirits, even when humans no longer see them, even when colonizers destroy them too. Recollet coined this term in a poem entitled Kinstallatory Gathering, which begins with the following lines. This is from Recollet. Kinstallatory gathering spaces, wishful thinking through dimmed light, making meaning out of the shadows, because sometimes shadow glyphs are all that we have left as our means for time travel. This is a placing, a landing of knowledge that at the same time points to a mode of ancestral fugitivity. Here, the relation is not bound by the limits of reason or proportion, and especially not by the anthropological marking of kin on charts, genealogies, or family trees, but expands the scale of possibilities through which Indigenous communities make meaning of and through the body. This meaning making shifts from the arborescent to the constellational, and from the rational to the embodied. Gathering in kinstallation makes possible the resonating of bodies in relation, the reverberating, kinetic sharing of space, through which we begin to recall how to travel through time, how to speak to shadows, how to negotiate our beings with and beings in relation as a form of ongoing enactment of Indigenous sovereignty, mutuality, and care. I hasten to add, this is not a metaphor. The land is not fictive or chosen kin. Our bodies are not symbolically made of stars. We are those cosmic elements. And in recognizing ourselves as cosmologically interrelated, as connecting cross-temporally as part of an emergent and ongoing epistemological project, we maintain the bonds of reciprocity and collaboration that are at the heart of our stories. Recollet situates this grounded and celestial knowledge as a method of time travel. This is also not a metaphor. When we look at the stars, we witness the past. Kinstallatory praxis is thus a form of trans-temporality that links stories of emergence with ancestral histories and future-oriented possibilities. These ways of knowing do not track onto normative timescapes, but rather are always situated in iterative becoming. In other words, kinstallations invoke an ancestral futurity that is grounded in our ways of relating to the human and the more than human across time, space, and feeling. Kinstallations are a means of living in the balance of rupture and creation. They mark us as poised across normative thresholds of intelligibility. It is tempting to describe this breach as a perpetual liminality, as the constitutive in-betweenness of being while not quite being. But the breach is more a feeling than a state of being, more potential than existential. It is also, if not primordially, a trace of future presence that calls from within, a beginning that has already begun. The sliding into materiality like momentum, like a force that oscillates between one thing and the next, between a thing and something else. In our constellations, we make sense of the abyss of infinite space and power, the sublime unfolding of space-time into ribbons of connective tissue. The gap between pine tree and star is a wound closing a scar like a heartbeat, like memory. We who have always been stars, we who are starring, returning to the heavens again as that which we were. The connective tissue of celestial healing is the very fact of our material life, the possibility of transcendence. This is the repair work of kinstallatory praxis, the doing of kinship, being in good relations. If we think back to the story of the Pleiades and the pine tree, I think we see that it is not just about movement or how the stars came to be, but also about how growth, the pine, can be something like a bridge between worlds, growing roots into the lower world, spanning up toward the heavens to the world above. Between is where we are now. In the Cherokee language, the word for center is also the word for nation. Chalagi Ayehli, Cherokee Nation, the center, where we are now, and is thus both a time and a place. Chalagi Ayehli. The final story that I would like to tell is about the origin of the Milky Way, and it goes like this. This is also from the Muni. Some people in the South had a corn mill in which they pounded the corn into meal. And several mornings when they came to fill it, they noticed that some of the meal had been stolen during the night. They examined the ground and found the tracks of a dog. So the next night they watched, and when the dog came from the north and began to eat the meal out of the bowl, they sprang out and whipped him. He ran off howling to his home in the north, with the meal dropping from his mouth as he ran and leaving behind a white trail where now we see the Milky Way, which the Cherokee call to this day Gili Uli Susda Nu Yi, where the dog ran. Like many origin stories, this one aims to explain something about the world around us. The origin of the Milky Way, of course, but there's something about this story that points to the connection between earth and sky too. In the Cherokee cosmology, corn is a gift from Selu, the corn mother, the wife of Ganati, the first man, deer hunter. Selu's children, however, do not trust her, and when they discover that the corn that she has been feeding them actually falls from her own body, they get scared and kill her. The boys drag her body around the ground to bury her, and her blood becomes the sprouts of corn that we still harvest today. Corn is the body of the mother of us all. Here too, we see an example of a kinstallation. In this case, it is the blood of Selu in the form of corn, the corn that the dog steals and drops from his mouth as he runs through the sky, also the material of the stars above. This may be an unorthodox interpretation, but it seems to me that the blood of Selu is both corn and star, both the material sustenance of everyday life and the thing we witness above when we dream about future worlds. In a way, it makes sense. There is a balance in the matter above and below, the corn like pine linking the two. If corn is the body of Selu, and corn is the substance that glimmers above as the stars of the Milky Way, then Selu is also star matter. And in that matter, which is both bodily and otherworldly, we find something of a gesture towards what I am trying to describe as kinstallatory, the connection across, the pathway that becomes a network, a line becomes a web. So when we acknowledge the land, can we also acknowledge the stars? What would this require of us? Not just to think about the telluric, but also the celestial. And in doing so, I think we can also find ways to act in accordance with the original instructions that were given to us by the land itself in its multiplicities and becomings. The land, in other words, does not need acknowledgement. It needs to be listened to as our most important teacher, as the stuff of stars and poetry, memory and futurity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for that really generative account of a future perfect otherwise, perhaps. Dr. Fari, please, when you're ready, we would love to hear your response.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shadi, and thank you, Joseph. I'm so glad that you started your remarks with a discussion of praxis. That's been a key concept that we've been referring back to over the course of the semester in my class. And we are defining it as the marriage of theory and practice. And I'm so glad that you reminded us that an acknowledgement as a written statement is not enough. Acknowledgements must seek accountability. And I'm especially, I don't want to say glad for a third time, but I am, that you called out some of the buzzwords and the catchphrases like stewardship. I would also add, as we're headed towards the Thanksgiving holiday, that we be wary of expressions of gratitude towards Indigenous people for quote unquote sharing their ancestral lands and knowledge. I went to an event where a land acknowledgement was framed in that way, and it just it gave me pause. So I had my students try their hands at writing land acknowledgements at the beginning of this semester. And thankfully they knew better than to use the type of gratitude, sharing, stewardship type of language. But for many, it was the first time that they'd been asked to independently research Indigenous histories and Indigenous presence of the places that they take for granted or call home. And so in doing that, it was my hope that the assignment would act as a sort of gateway drug, getting them to want to begin to take the necessary steps to build the relationships integral to solidarity and to coalition politics, which we've also been discussing in our course throughout the semester as well. As we have progressed in our learning journey, my students and I have been thinking really deeply about how we might activate and apply all that we are learning together. And it seems like the concept of ancestral futurity might present some kind of starting point. So thank you for introducing me to the term ancestral futurity. I have to admit that I've been a little bit skeptical of what may at times seem like academic jargon, for example, decolonial or fugitivity or futurity. But given the context of its use, I feel like it's only fitting when I went to find out more about this concept and this term. It's only fitting that I take the definition from Dancing Earth, which is a contemporary Indigenous dance company based in Northern California. And they activate ancestral futurity by, quote, reaching into the constellations to remember ancestral stories of creation after destruction to guide us forward. And I love the way that they interpret the concept with their bodies in motion. The term ancestral futurity immediately makes me think of the West African Akan concept of Sankofa, which loosely translates to go back and get it. Sankofa also refers to the Adinkra symbol common in the West African visual cultures, where it's represented either with a stylized heart shape or by a bird with its head turned backwards while its feet face forward and carrying in its mouth a precious egg. So it turns out that maybe I already knew what ancestral futurity was all about. I just hadn't heard that specific language used to describe it. One thing that I took away from the story that you shared about the 7 boys was the notion that dance and physical movement is not only a tool for time travel, but also a communication device that brings different forces into conversation, like a prayer. And as a Black American, the details of whose ancestry get lost with the violence and repression of the transatlantic slave trade, I've grown up with the knowledge that singing, dancing, and music making are all forms of prayer. They are, to borrow the word that I just learned from you, kinstallatory, the connection across, the pathway that becomes a network, a line becomes a web. So when you were discussing the wisdom, the theory encoded in the creation stories of the Cherokee, I couldn't help but think of the Dogon people of Mali, who are known for their knowledge of astronomy. As documented by French anthropologists Marcel Griol and Germaine Dieterlen, the two social scientists were surprised by the level of accuracy and sophistication of the Dogon's knowledge of the star system Sirius, which had only just been discovered by Europeans thanks to breakthroughs in science and technology back in the 1930s. And they looked at these Black Indigenous people and they were like, what is going on here? Griol and Dieterlen watched in awe as the Dogon danced the orbital pattern of the smaller star Sirius B around the larger star Sirius A. I was first introduced to the Dogon's role as a sacred keeper of astronomical knowledge through the documentary A Journey into the Secret Life of Plants, which I will happily share the link to because you can watch it for free on YouTube. And so this documentary was actually hosted by Stevie Wonder. It came out in 1978, and he also created the soundtrack to the documentary film. And the soundtrack has been described by a Pitchfork editor, Andy Beta, as a sprawling, misunderstood double album about the interconnections of ecology and the Black experience. It was based on the documentary, and the documentary itself had been based on this best-selling book, which, to try to sum it up into a very reduced synopsis, is about how plants can beat lie detector tests, how the fern in your house reacts to your emotions, and how mustard seeds can communicate with distant galaxies. Wonder's hit song, A Seed is a Star, seems to be especially apt in light of the Cherokee creation story that you just shared. And he wrote the song based on Dogon cosmology. So the Dogon conceive of the unformed universe as a sort of primordial ball that contained all of the potential seeds or signs of the future universe. And this ball was known as Amma's egg. And Amma was the supreme creator, which was a genderless deity that embodies duality. Dogon artistic renderings of the egg take the same cone-like shape as the event horizon of a black hole. And Stephen Hawking described the black hole as an astronomical body that most closely resembles what the unformed universe may have looked like. Likewise, Dogon descriptions of the formation of the universe from Amma's egg are distinctly reminiscent of the Big Bang Theory. I absolutely loved your question towards the end of your talk, where you asked, so when we acknowledge the land, can we also acknowledge the stars? What would this require of us? I'm still thinking and feeling my way through that provocation. But while I ponder, I wanted to refract the question back to you by asking, when we acknowledge the stars, when we acknowledge that space is the place, can we also truly acknowledge the land? And what would that look like? Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I think there's a lot to think about regarding the knowledge of stars, the knowledge that is created through our relationships with stars, I think about not just sort of science catching up with Indigenous knowledge, or, all of a sudden, there's some article in, Huffington Post or something that says, oh, the scientists confirm, and I think that one of the things that this reminds me of is that when we put ourselves within our own epistemologies, then the relationships with stars are not ontologically, they are not the same thing as they are in a Western understanding of that is an object up there that I am able to study, but rather it is a relative, perhaps a being, perhaps a type of ancestor, a brother, that you have a relationship with and that you have a responsibility towards. And so the stars teach us how to relate to the land, just like the land teaches us how to relate to the stars. And I'm glad that you brought up the term ancestral futurity. I want to recognize that is a term that I've been thinking about in community for a while, and it's a term that I first heard from S.J. Norman, who's my co-curator and kin of Knowledge of Wounds, which is a project that we share. And I can put a link in the chat for those who want to know more. We had a sort of transcribed conversation about that. But there are other people who are working around, I think, this issue of the ancestral future. Chinupa Hanska-Luger is an amazing artist who's also working on these issues. Karen Recollet, Emily Johnson, based in New York. So there's a bit of movement around how do we imagine futures for ourselves in spite of the breach, in spite of the rupture, in spite of the violence of the past and the scars that we bear on our bodies. And I think that's the work, that's the it's a term that I think has a lot of potential, and I'm trying to figure out, the best way to kind of mobilize the thickness of that concept.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pierce, and thank you, Dr. Nzinga. We have a few minutes for questions, so I want to encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your dashboard to ask a question of our guest or respondent. Since we don't have any yet, I will ask a question just to fill some space. Would that be all right? So, Dr. Pierce, I am so taken also with this notion of a kind of future presence and a way in which movement that is nonlinear and non-teleological might make that happen. I'm reminded of Fanon in the final chapter of Black Skin, White Masks. He quotes Marx's 18th Brumaire and says, calls for a poetry from the future. He says that poetry is when we can perceive, but not yet recognize. It kind of exceeds the common senses and the hermeneutical lens that we currently have available to us. And so what does it mean to feel that future and not be able to see it, right? And so what is dance and movement? And there's a scholar who I study, Jared Sexton, who writes about dancing to the madness. He says, dance to the madness, for there's freedom there in our unending, uninterrupted captivity, a mad freedom that will set you free. And of course, he's speaking specifically to the particularities of racial Blackness, but I think that the critique of fugitivity and genocide is one that we can and should extend to an Indigenous context.
I'd be curious to know what Sexton has to say about that. I think that that's an audacious connection that you're making, actually, but one that, from my perspective, is more about harnessing vibrational relationships between bodies as a method of reparative praxis. That's something that dance does. That's something that singing does. I think that's also something that our bodies are already doing, right? Our cells are already in motion. Our bodies are already vibrating. Like there's a vibration to the cosmos and all of that, right? And I think that if we are able to consider the possibility that relationships depend on vibrational frictions as opposed to easily established slick relationships, but rather are themselves always in a type of kinetic relationship, then we can also start to expand the possibilities of what the poetics of survivance, to use Visionor's term, or the poetics of indigiqueer life, to think back to Billy Ray Belcourt or Joshua Whitehead, or the poetics of refusal, to think along with Glenn Coulthard or Audra Simpson, or glissant and the always already mutually imbricated poetics of relation that is actually truer to our senses of relation than is any type of sort of Western concept of taxonomical ordering of bodies and desires. So I would say that, like, just to like not, be like, Western taxonomies are on pause and we're doing this other thing, which is actually the thing that we've always been doing.
Thank you. And you're right, it was audacious of me, but I do think I was trained in that vein, and I do think it's important to push back on it, which is what I try to do with my scholarship. So moving on, I have a question from an anonymous attendee regarding your piece on monstering, and they're wondering if you feel there's a connection between expanding our understandings to include more than just the land and expanding our ideas on human versus monster, especially in queer communities.
I love that question. So the reference is to an article that I wrote about trans and travesti embodiment in Argentina and Chile, specifically the work of Claudia Rodriguez in Chile and Susie Schock in Argentina. And what I was sort of perceiving as a rejection of multicultural inclusion in favor of a occupying the space and the embodiment of the monster as a form of poetic resistance to multicultural inclusion in the Southern Cone. But in doing research for that piece, one of the things I had to do was go back to like Aristotle, and Aristotle is one of the original sort of taxonomy people, inventors of taxonomies, and woman is the first monster according to Aristotle, the first divergence from the norm, if that is how we understand monstrosity. So I think it's really important to think about what monstering, like how the monster is a concept that is culturally, that is predicated on a particular cultural system, which may or may not travel, and which can be harnessed by those same communities, queer communities. We can think to Frankenstein, we can think to Susan Stryker's work, in a way that allows us to undermine the very structures of normativity that have put us in a place of abjection in relation to the structural ordering of bodily norms, gender binaries, racialized taxonomies, all of that.
Thank you so much. We have another question. And they preface this also from anonymous attendee, and they preface this by saying that that this may be a surface level question, but is there a Cherokee tradition regarding daily activities being guided by the stars or other celestial beings? And they say that they're thinking about the tradition of planting by the moon or zodiac signs in Appalachian contexts. And if so, if there's a reference you might recommend, and that they're actually looking at a book called Myths of the Cherokee, and perhaps if that is something they should look at, or perhaps not.
I mean, the Mooney text is the sort of classic anthropology of Cherokee stories from Cherokee, North Carolina, in the early 20th century. So sure, I mean, it's a source, but take that with a big heaping grain of salt. There are a few other more contemporary story collections that I can put in the chat, but I would say that just one thing that I'll say about daily practice is if you do a little bit of if you look at the sort of layout of Cherokee villages in Appalachia, most of the villages are on the west side of a river, because the main daily practice was to go to water. That's what it's called, to go to water, meaning go to the river facing east to greet the day with a daily bath or washing. So is that a celestial tradition? I would say yes, in which you greet the day facing east, and so yeah, I mean, I would say yes.
Thank you so much. We have time for another question if anyone wants to pop a question into the Q&A.
While we're waiting for the last question, I just wanted to say that I went ahead and shared links in the chat, Joseph, of your Performance Space New York article about the exhibition knowledge or performance knowledge of wounds. And then about, I also put in the link from Movement Research, the conversation between you and S.J. Norman, which I just was fascinated by. So I hope that folks who are attending this Zoom will definitely check that out.
Thank you, Dr. Nzinga. Our final question is, how can allies of Indigenous peoples make meaningful change for Indigenous peoples? How can we help, especially poor people who can't do much for the land back movement?
I want to start with the second part of that question.
Yeah.
I think we need to understand what land back means, and what doing can mean. Doing can mean being a good relative. doing can mean not taking colonial bullshit when it happens. It can mean standing in solidarity with Indigenous peoples when they are making demands, not what you think the demands are, but what they say the demands are. So I would say that that land back is not about donating money so that Indigenous people can buy back land. It's more of a logical extension to the idea that if decolonization is not a metaphor, then the logical extension of that is the land has to be returned, because otherwise it is simply another set of performative interventions. And one of the things that I think is important to note about that is land back doesn't mean, well, for some people, land back means like white people got to go. For some other people, land back means we have to establish ways of relating to land that incorporate people as kin, as relatives to the land itself, which is not the same as saying, you know, go back to Europe. And I understand, you know, the kind of more radical anarcho-Indigenous feminists who say that, and I am in solidarity with that. At the same time, I think what I'm talking about in this talk here is more about turning people into relatives. If we are able if you are able to be a good relative and understand what that means, then you're not going to be extractive. You're not going to be repeating the same types of colonial violence by doubling down on some sort of settler narrative of absolution from your sins of you know, like being a settler colonist. Like, that's not the point. The point is, how do you begin to relate to the land in a way that that is less extractive, less violent, less colonial, and more in line with being a relative to the land rather than a stranger to the land.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pierce, and thank you for taking the afternoon to chat with us. I'm so grateful for your generative remarks and for helping us think through the performance of anti-colonialism versus what it will really take to create a world order that is accountable to Indigenous genocide and erasure. I thank you again, and I thank our community for coming out. And I want to remind you that the Truth Talk tonight at 6 p.m. will also be addressing similar issues. Thank you so much.